Today's lesson is on RI 5.8. Explain how an author uses reasons and evidence to support particular points in a text, identifying which reasons and evidence support which points. So essentially what we're going to do today, guys, is we're going to look at some lessons that talk about communicating codes, and we're going to analyze how authors use evidence to support their points. Before we get into that, though, I want you guys to see your I can statements this week. Your I can statements are: I can identify which reasons support particular points in a text. I can identify which evidence support particular points in a text. I can evaluate and explain connection between reasons and particular points in a text. I can evaluate and explain the connection between evidence and particular points in a text. Those are your I can statements. So I'm going to go ahead and read this comic to you. Hey, want to go outside? Can't. I'm developing a code for secret messages. Why do you need that? It's my brother. He keeps reading my diary. He does? What's your evidence? Well, my diary keeps moving around the room. I keep finding it open. And he keeps telling me to write more neatly. Only if it's not a problem. So, with this cartoon that we just saw, the author is trying to get something across, and he or she is developing their points. So what are the points that they're developing here? Well, the girl's main point here is that her diary keeps being read by her brother. And supporting details for this, or what's the evidence that the author gives? The author gives three main points here. She says she keeps finding her diary in different places around the room. She also says that she keeps finding her diary open. And finally, she says that her brother tells her to write more neatly. So I'm going to go ahead and read this out loud to you guys. And then we're going to find some, the main thing we're looking here for is what evidence does the author use to support his or her claim, or to support this. So the title of it is The Power of Codes. Secret codes and power go hand in hand. Why is this so? Because a code lets a group of people communicate information in a way that keeps it secret from other groups. The group that knows the code has an advantage over the group that doesn't. Take the example of Julius Caesar, an emperor of ancient Rome who conquered much of Europe and North Africa. Caesar used letters to communicate his military plans to faraway generals. But what if an opposing army obtained copies of his letters? His plans might be foiled. So Caesar developed a code that only he and trusted members of his army understood. If an enemy intercepted Caesar's letters, they would not understand them or be able to prepare for his plans. The code gave Caesar an advantage over his opponents, letting him keep and increase his power. Not all codes were as successful as Caesar's, however. In the 1500s, when Elizabeth I was Queen of England, her cousin Mary plotted to overthrow her. Mary communicated with her allies through coded messages. However, Mary's code was easy to crack, so her plan was discovered. If Mary had used a better code, she might have risen to power as the Queen of England. Codes remain important in modern times. During World War II, 1939 to 1945, German submarines communicated in code so complicated that it was nearly unbreakable. But a brilliant Englishman named Alan Turing cracked the German code. Now the English knew when and where a British ship would be targeted, they could fight back. When the Germans' code was broken, they lost a powerful advantage. Secret codes aren't just about power, of course. It's fun to develop a code to communicate secrets, but when rulers and armies use codes, they're not doing so for fun. For them, it's serious business. So what I'd like to do now is I want you guys to watch as I underline things in here that are important examples. So they're examples that show the secret codes are related to both keeping and losing power. So here's the first one. So Caesar developed a code. The code gave Caesar an advantage over his opponents, letting him keep and increase his power. If Mary had used a better code, she might have risen to power as the Queen of England. Alan Turing cracked the German code. English knew when and where the British ship would be targeted. They could fight back. When the Germans' code was broken, they lost a powerful advantage. So those things I just underlined are examples that show the secret codes and how they're related to both keeping and losing power. I hope you guys understand that, because that's kind of what this whole thing is about. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about that article. I want you guys to watch as I do this for you, and then you guys can do this on your own here in a second. The author states that secret codes and power go hand in hand. Complete the chart with 3 pieces of evidence he uses to support his point. So what is the author's main point? The author's main point is that secret codes and power go hand in hand. So what is his evidence? So if you look over here, we'll talk about the evidence. So the first thing he said is Julius Caesar used a secret code and letters to his generals. That's a point that he makes, and he supports that with facts. Elizabeth I held on to power because Mary's coded letters were too easy to figure out. That also supports that secret codes keep you in power. And finally, after Alan Turing cracked the German code, the British knew when their ships were targeted. So you guys are going to fill out something like this yourself when you're finding details that support the author's argument. So I'm going to read this one to you. This one's called the Slave Quilt Code. This is one that you guys need to we need to read, and then we're going to answer some questions on as well. Back in the 1990s, an intriguing idea arose. People began claiming that during the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, African slaves in the southern states used a secret code to help one another escape north to freedom. This code consisted of patterns sewed into quilt blocks by slave women. For example, a pattern called wagon wheel meant to quickly load up a wagon and prepare to head north. And a pattern called shoe fly signaled that a friendly guide waited nearby to help. Such quilts helped runaway slaves to make their way along a network of routes known as the Underground Railroad to freedom. Films and books sprang up about these bed covers with their secret messages sewn by slave women and saved lives and led enslaved people to freedom. The popular Oprah Winfrey TV show even featured these claims and stories. The public loved these thrilling accounts of adventure from America's past. But wait, how true were they? The quilt code accounts were exciting, yes, and people wanted them to be historically accurate. But were they? Many historians have studied slavery and the Underground Railroad. These historians reviewed the evidence. None of it appeared to come directly from slaves. They concluded there were no letters and no news articles quoting the slaves themselves. It came from the stories passed along by word of mouth, and none of the quilts used to help runaway slaves could be found. Still, many books were written concerning these oral accounts, exciting stories of secret hiding places, life-threatening encounters, and midnight escapes. But there were no documents to back up these quilt code claims. Based on a lack of strong evidence, we must conclude that quilts played no special role in the Underground Railroad. So again, this time I'm going to underline information supporting this idea that quilts played no special role. So here we go again. None of it appeared to come directly from slaves. They concluded there were no letters and no news articles quoting the slaves themselves, and none of the quilts used to help runaway slaves could be found. So those are the things I underlined. So now what I want you guys to do is I want you guys to look at these questions. I'll read them. The answer will pop up. You'll have to answer these questions in the spiral lesson as well. Here's the first question about what we just read. This question has 2 parts. Answer part A, then answer part B. How does the author support his idea that people wanted to believe African slaves in the South used a secret code? Is it A, B, C, or D? By showing that history of the quilt code wasn't known before the 1990s and then it became a popular topic? B, by showing that experts believe quilts patterns had different meanings and gave signals to escaping slaves. C, by showing the slave codes were related to the Underground Railroad, which is an interesting topic. Or D, by showing the stories about the quilt codes were subjects of popular books, films, and shows. And the answer is D, by showing the stories about the quilt codes were subjects of popular books, films, and shows. Part B, which piece of evidence from the article supports the answer in Part A? A, the Oprah Winfrey TV show even featured these claims. B, many historians had studied slavery in the Underground Railroad. C, it all came from stories passed along by word of mouth. Or D, there were no documents to back up these quilt code claims. The answer is A. Okay, that's all we're going to do on that page. Let's move on to actually going back to the power of codes, and we are going to write a short response, which you guys will do here eventually as well. The author states that a group with a secret code has an advantage over groups without a secret code. Explain how the author supports his points. Use details from the passage. So remember, our points here that we made are that Julius Caesar was able to stay in power, Elizabeth II was not able to stay in power, and Alan Turing broke the German code, and that's how the British were able to figure out when their ships were being bombed. So here's what we came up with. And this is just a sample example here for you. Alan Kim, that's the author of the article, uses examples from history to support his point that a group with secret code has an advantage over groups without one. One example is Julius Caesar, who used code to describe his plans to members of his army. It would not matter if Caesar's enemies intercepted his letters, because they would not be able to understand what they said. This gave Caesar an advantage over his enemies. A second example is the work of Alan Turing, who cracked the German code that conveyed messages about submarine warfare. Because Turing cracked the code, the Germans lost a big advantage over the British in World War II. See how we've implemented the two of the main points in there, and we've supported the point of what Kim is trying to do, that a secret code people who use secret codes have an advantage over groups that do not. Okay, this is our last thing we're going to do today before you guys get started on your work. So going back to the slave quilt, what was the author's main point here? The author's main point was that Friedel, the author of the article, believes that quilts with secret coded messages did not play a role in the Underground Railroad. What was his evidence? How did he support this? He said that no quilts were found with a secret message. He supported that. Historians said that. And there was not any first-hand evidence from enslaved and escaped people about the quilts. Last thing we're going to do is I want you guys to look at this. Here's our short response. How does the author support his point about quilts not having secret messages? Provide two examples. Sample response. Ron Friedel concludes quilts played no special role in the Underground Railroad. To support his point, Friedel states that historians who studied the Underground Railroad have found no concrete evidence such as the quilts themselves. Friedel also states that historians found no letters or news articles, including quotes from enslaved or escaped people about such quilts. Lacking evidence in the form of either quilts or documents, the author believes that we cannot assume that quilts with the secret codes played a role in the Underground Railroad. So what you guys are going to do today is you guys are going to do some of the same kind of things here. You're going to be reading some articles, and you're going to tell me what are the main points or reasons the author gives. Your work is in Google Classroom, and you'll see further instructions here in a bit.